I often have been asked questions like, how do I bear being unable to move? Or how can I stand it? And the question always seemed kind of interesting to me. How do I? And but I was never able to answer the question because I realize now that it wasn't what I was involved with. What I was attending to was something of an affirmative nature, something that interested me. Like, for example, if I were with a patient, and I was with the patient, and I was absorbed in whatever interaction we were having, or in trying to understand what was going on with the patient. So I wasn't thinking about what it was like to be disabled. When one thinks about being disabled, what's on his mind is what he can't do. And when I'm thinking about what I can't do and my deficiencies, that's a very depressing thing for me. And I don't feel absorbed in life. But when things outside myself interest me, and I can get involved in them, then I'm not aware of being disabled. So it's really a matter of attention. And so in answer to the question, I don't really think of it in terms of spirit or courage, but rather whether one can find things in life that are interesting that he can commit himself to. And I've been fortunate that I've been able to do that. I think most everyone who is disabled asks the question, why me? It's kind of a fruitless thing because I suppose the alternative question is, why not me? It's not an event that has any reason. I know that I searched for all sorts of reasons. What terrible crime had I committed? And I think everyone thinks like that. And that's one of the malignant parts of it, that you tend to begin to think there must be something wrong with you inherently. I think that's a terribly inhibiting thing. I think the question, why not me, is probably more productive because there isn't really an answer. Some people, if they have strong religious convictions and can fit that into a religious framework, can find solace in that way, that it's God's will. That, I think, in certain respects, simply saying that there is no reason for it is closely akin to that, although perhaps not as affirmative. But everybody has to come to terms with that in his own way. But it is a fruitless question. You can never find out a reason. The world is an able-bodied world. And when I'm feeling good about myself, I feel as like everybody else, like I can do what everybody else does. And then when I encounter some limitation, large or small, or where I'm not accepted in a situation, then I'm suddenly thrust back in that feeling of, gosh, there must be something wrong with me again. I don't know that there's a good antidote to that, but it's to realize that the world isn't made to fit the people in it. The world is made the way it is, and we have to find ways of dealing with that. In that connection, there's always the question of how much effort should go into advocating that the world change to accommodate us and how much attention should be focused on our own responsibilities to work within the structure. I think that's true for everyone. And the only thing I can say is that we have to go forward on both fronts. Sometimes, in the question of expecting the world to accommodate to me, where I'll ask for something and people will be affronted by it. They'll think, aren't you going too far? And I often think myself, maybe I am expecting too much. On the other hand, that's the only way that I may be able to accomplish something. A lot depends on how you do these things. I think you can raise questions with people, express your point of view, and even demand it, but in a way that is explained, the logic of it, so that people are more accepting of it. Not that this always works, but again, the question has to do with how much responsibility we can take. People tend, in my experience, to be accessible if they're not threatened. If you push them too hard, then they're frightened. But if I can express my vulnerabilities, they're less frightened. And really, that's what we're talking about in all these things. It's our own vulnerabilities. I think anyone should ask for anything he can get. And I don't see any limitations to trying to get what you want. The only question in my mind has to do with the strategy. And in my mind, the most useful strategy has been, now I may be basing this strictly on my limited experience, but has been to show clearly that I can understand what it's like for other people. If I can do that, they're more likely to understand what it's like for me. That doesn't mean that I don't feel angry sometimes, affronted sometimes. But anger, in my experience, anger has never been a very useful thing. When it can be honed into an assertive position, that can be useful. Assertive but not offensive. No one I know chose to be disabled. And it is frustrating. It means there are things that are more difficult for us to do than for other people. And frustration is a part of it. In a way, I've sometimes thought of the fact that if there is an advantage to being disabled, it makes us more human than other people. More human in the sense that we know more keenly the frustrations of trying to live in the world. Everyone has that, but we see it more clearly. Maybe that's the function of being disabled, to help the world to see more clearly the frustrations of trying to accommodate to it. And by doing that, maybe we can help the world to be a bit more flexible and not so rigid. I think everybody has to do what he has to do. Now, to live my life as my friend in the next bed did, that is to go home and spend the next 20 years in one room, never moving, never doing anything except accepting passively and often grudgingly what others brought to him, that would have been utterly intolerable for me. So I don't see myself as having achieved something greater than he. It's simply that that was not tolerable for me, whereas that was quite acceptable for him. So I think there are different ways of dealing with it. And I don't begrudge or condemn anyone for however they deal with a disability. I think that it depends on what you like to do and what you can't tolerate. I don't think intelligence has anything to do with it. The particular person I'm talking about was a good deal smarter than I was and better educated. He had an advanced degree and had an amazing fund of knowledge and an incredible sense of humor. So it certainly wasn't a matter of intelligence. My life has been turned to a life of the mind because my body didn't function, and I've found rewards from it. But I didn't think of myself as an intellectual at all before. In fact, as I've said earlier, sports were the most important thing in my life. That was what I saw as my major activity, my major source of pleasure, and where anything else I did was simply as a means of getting to sports. Well, that was where the real action of life was. For me, you have to deal with whatever you've got. And I was preoccupied with sports and unable to participate in sports. That was my enormous frustration. And the first thing I did was, not deliberately, but simply as a way of finding some way of dealing with this intense energy that had no means of expression. I got interested in watching sports or listening to games. The idea of listening to radio to hear a baseball game, not one of the sports I was particularly interested in, would have been one of the most horrible experiences I could imagine when I was able-bodied. But baseball on radio happened to be one of the few things that was available to me in sports. And so I began listening. And I got increasingly interested, increasingly knowledgeable about it. And then gradually I began to see things about the ways in which people participate, and I developed a whole career out of that. But it wasn't because I had deliberately sought it, but rather because I was trying to find some means of furthering the interest that had been cut off from me. Before I became disabled, because sports were the most important thing in my life, that's what I felt most deprived of. So I had to find some way of using that energy that had gone into sports. And it may seem obvious that I couldn't express myself as I had before, but I did become a fan. I really hadn't been a fan particularly before. I'd been more or less bored by the activities of others on an athletic field. What I was interested in was my own activities. But I did get interested in that. And then as I developed a profession, I began to become interested in how I could integrate what I knew about sports with that. And so I became involved in things having to do with the psychology of sport. And for many years, that was one of the major thrusts of my professional activity. And it was, in a way, like being reborn. You know, it meant that I could participate in sports in a new way, vicariously, but it was very satisfying. It was when I was a consultant to the commissioner of baseball, for example, going to the All-Star game was very exciting for me. I think that's what we all want to find, is something we can be passionate about. I remember a Peanuts cartoon that I always really could identify with, when good old Charlie Brown said that when he grew up he wanted to be a fanatic. It's not the deleterious effects of being a fanatic that are appealing. It's rather the full conviction that what you're doing is right and important. Another example that comes to mind has to do with people who are disabled, who become very involved in advocacy. That's a way of expressing something that is so dear to them. Whether or not they accomplish their tasks in the world may not be quite as important. Well, I don't want to minimize the importance of that, but it certainly does a great deal for them. I remember the first time I went to an independent living center, and I met people who were deeply involved in forwarding causes for the disabled. I was amazed by the spirit and the involvement with life that these people had. And yet it had come out of what had been their primary interest. And I think that's true of anyone. The artist, for example, who is able to express his personal conflicts, the struggles he's had to face in his artistic form, whether it's visual arts or music or whatever. People sometimes speak about courage or such things for people who are disabled. I'm not sure that quite describes it, because the question really is, what's the alternative? I mean, would one prefer to be down, thinking about all of the things he couldn't do? Or would one prefer to be engaged with life? There's nothing inherently good about disability as far as I'm concerned. I don't know too many people, I don't know anyone who would choose to be disabled. But since it is a fact for many of us, the question is how best to live with it. Coming to terms with what was available to me and what could interest me, where I could become absorbed, made time accelerate. And when I'm fully absorbed, I'm not aware of time at all. So those were important things for me. And I don't like that feeling that time drags. It's not a good feeling at all. It's depressing. Maybe the essence of depression. So I know a little bit about the alternative to that. So anything I can get absorbed with. Sometimes I do that when I'm feeling down by trying to just let my senses play on what there is outside myself. But anything that will absorb you with life. At the time I wrote it, I was really interested in getting it straight in my own mind. I really wasn't thinking about how it might be useful to others. I have to say that quite selfishly. The fact that it has been of interest and use to others, of course, is very rewarding to me. but it was not my initial purpose. The newer book is a graceful passage, which has to do with coming to terms with death. And as I'm now a senior citizen, and my health has always been very precarious. I've been on life supports for 40 years, and naturally, with the ravages of age added to that, I'm often in a very tenuous state of survival. And so I wanted to come to terms with that. Death had become a preoccupation for me when I was feeling bad, and that kept me from my involvement with life. So coming to terms with that was important. And that was the purpose in writing that. There's another book that'll be out in about 6 months, and that has to do with another side of this whole thing, and that is trying to identify some of the things that make life worth living. And the focus of it is on friendship, which has been such a supportive and important part of my life. The friends who I've had have been one of the things that has kept me going. The title of the book is The Only Gift. It's taken from a quote from Emerson: "The only gift is a portion of thyself." And I think in a close friendship, you are giving a portion of yourself and receiving a portion of someone else. The interesting part of that for me is that while the feeling of commitment, of oneness between friends is the same, when they try to identify what they get from the friendship, it's often very different, and that was certainly true in my experience. What I saw in the relationships I had with my friends, when I showed what I'd written to them, they had very different ideas. So ultimately I had to include those in the book too. You know, there's enough going on in everybody's life where there are forces of decline and sadness, tragedy. I mean, you don't have to look very far to find those. And at the same time, there are also forces of creation and joy, development. And those two processes are going on everywhere in the universe, with every person, with every group of people. And the crucial issue to me seems to be which of those two groups of processes one attends to most in his own mind, and which he identifies with. It's very easy for me when I'm feeling down to be primarily concerned with those forces of decline and what I can't do. But if I can also try to look to find the other side, they're also there. And those are the ones that give me pleasure and keep me going.